Subscribe to my YouTube channel. You won't believe what happens next. The cold evening breeze swept through the streets as the city lights flickered like tiny stars against the darkening sky. Two little girls, no older than 7, sat on the steps of a grand towering building, their small hands clutching a crumpled envelope. Their clothes were worn, their shoes scuffed, but their eyes, big, round, and filled with something unbreakable, held on to hope. Lena and Lily were twins, identical in almost every way, except for the tiny dimple on Lily's right cheek. Since their mother passed away, they had learned to rely on each other. Their father, well, he wasn't around much. He worked late, struggled to keep food on the table, and barely had the energy to notice the sadness that lingered in their home. But tonight wasn't about sadness. Tonight was about hope. The girls had spent weeks saving up their pennies, collecting loose change from kind strangers, and even selling small hand-drawn sketches on the sidewalk. All for this one moment. They had one wish, a wish so innocent, so heartbreakingly pure, that it could melt even the coldest heart. Their tiny hands trembled as they clutched their envelope tightly. Inside was a letter, written in the clumsy, uneven handwriting of children, addressed to their mother in heaven. But there was a problem. They didn't know how to send it. Lena had an idea, though. One she had whispered to Lily late at night, when they huddled together in their tiny bedroom, their blankets barely warm enough to keep the cold away. If anyone can send a letter to heaven, she had whispered, it's a really, really rich person. And so here they were, sitting in front of the most powerful man in the city's headquarters. Richard Sterling. A billionaire, a man whose name was on the tallest buildings, whose face appeared in business magazines, and whose hands had signed million-dollar deals like they were nothing. To the world he was ruthless, a man of numbers and power, but to Lena and Lily, he was their only hope. They had seen his face on TV. He had connections. He had influence. Surely he could get a letter to heaven. Right? So they waited. People in fancy suits passed by without noticing them. Some looked at them with curiosity, others with pity, but no one stopped. Until a sleek black car pulled up to the front of the building. A driver in a sharp uniform stepped out and rushed to open the door, and then he appeared. Richard Sterling. He looked exactly like he did in the magazines. Tall, sharp-featured, with the kind of presence that made the world pause for a second. He was busy, checking his watch, talking on the phone. He barely noticed the little girl sitting at his doorstep until Lena took a deep breath, stood up, and ran toward him. "Excuse me, sir." Her tiny voice cut through the noise. Richard stopped mid-step, his eyebrows slightly furrowed as he glanced down. People usually didn't approach him like this, especially not children. His security guard moved forward, ready to push her aside, but Richard held up a hand. Lena hesitated, suddenly nervous, but then Lily joined her, clutching the letter. "Please," Lena said, her voice shaking but determined. "Can you send this to our mom? She's in heaven." For the first time in what felt like forever, Richard Sterling was speechless. The air seemed to shift around them. The busy streets, the honking cars, the flashing lights, everything faded as he stared at the small, crumpled envelope in the little girl's hands. He was about to brush it off, about to tell them that wasn't possible. But then Lily pulled out something from her tiny backpack, a photograph. She held it up to him with both hands, and the moment Richard's eyes landed on it, his entire face changed. His grip on his phone loosened. His breath hitched. The color drained from his face, because in that old faded photograph was a face he never thought he'd see again. a woman from his past. A secret buried deep, and a truth he never expected to come knocking on his door. Richard Sterling's fingers trembled as he reached for the photograph. He hadn't felt this way in years, like the ground beneath him had suddenly disappeared, leaving him weightless and lost. His heartbeat pounded in his ears as his sharp eyes scanned the faded image. It was her soft smile, the way her hair fell across her shoulders, the warmth in her eyes. Time had aged the photo, but he would recognize that face anywhere. His chest tightened. He hadn't spoken her name in years, hadn't allowed himself to think about her. And yet, here she was, right in front of him, staring back at him from a worn-out piece of paper held by two little girls with matching eyes. His throat felt dry. Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lena and Lily exchanged a glance before looking back up at him. "She's our mom," Lily said softly, her small fingers still gripping the photograph. "She went to heaven last year." Richard's breath hitched. Their mom. His mind spun, trying to process what that meant. 1,000 emotions surged inside him, but he forced himself to stay composed. He wasn't the kind of man who let feelings get in the way. He was a businessman, a billionaire. Logic ruled his world, not emotions. But this was different. He looked down at the letter in Lena's hands. She stared at him with wide, hopeful eyes. "Can you send it to her?" she asked again. "You're really rich, so maybe you know how." For the first time in years, Richard Sterling didn't know what to say. A heavy silence settled between them. His security team shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to step in. His assistant, who had been walking just a few steps behind him, looked just as confused as the rest. Richard could have walked away. He could have dismissed it as some bizarre coincidence, a moment that didn't concern him, but he couldn't. Instead, he exhaled sharply and did something he never did. He crouched down, right there, in the middle of the cold, polished steps of his billion-dollar empire, and looked the girls in the eyes. "What was her name?" he asked. Lena smiled proudly. Olivia Carter." The name struck him like lightning. His hands curled into fists, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. He swallowed hard, pushing down the storm of emotions rising inside him. He had known Olivia a long time ago, back when money wasn't his whole world, back when he was just a struggling man with nothing but ambition and a fire in his soul. She had been there, his light, his anchor, until he lost her, until he walked away, and now. She had 2 daughters. His gaze flickered between them, scanning every detail, the shape of their noses, the curve of their smiles. He didn't want to believe it, but deep down, something told him he already knew the truth. They were his blood, his daughters. The realization hit him like a freight train, leaving him breathless. Lena and Lily didn't know. They had no idea who he was. They just wanted to send a letter to their mother, and here he was, a billionaire who could make anything happen. Yet he had no idea how to give these 2 little girls what they wanted most. Richard Sterling had closed million-dollar deals with nothing but confidence. He had faced powerful rivals without blinking. He had built an empire from the ground up, but right now, facing these 2 innocent children, he felt powerless. His past had come back, and it had 2 pairs of big, hopeful eyes staring right at him. But before he could say another word, before he could even begin to process what to do next, a voice called out, "Girls, there you are!" A frazzled-looking man rushed up the steps, his eyes filled with both relief and frustration. He was out of breath, his clothes slightly wrinkled, like he had been searching for them for hours. Richard recognized him immediately. Jacob Carter, Olivia's brother. The moment Jacob's eyes landed on Richard, his expression shifted. Shock, anger, and something else Richard couldn't quite place. He grabbed the girls protectively. "What are you doing here?" His tone was sharp, his grip firm. Lena and Lily looked confused. "We just wanted to send a letter to Mom," Lily said quietly. Jacob's jaw tightened. He turned his gaze to Richard, eyes burning with something dangerous. "You stay away from them," he said, his voice low and filled with warning. Richard slowly stood up, his mind still spinning, his heart pounding against his ribs. Jacob knew. He knew who they were. He knew the truth, and he didn't want Richard anywhere near them. Richard Sterling had never backed down from a fight. But this time, it wasn't about power. It wasn't about winning. It was about something much, much bigger, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he could fix it. Richard Sterling held Jacob's glare, his mind racing. He had built his entire life on control, on knowing every possible outcome before making a move. But this was a storm he had never prepared for. His daughters, his own flesh and blood, had grown up without him, and now their uncle, the only father figure they had ever known, was standing between him and the truth. "Jacob," Richard said, his voice even but firm, "we need to talk." "There's nothing to talk about," Jacob snapped, pulling the girls closer. "You left Olivia. You left all of this behind. You don't get to come back now just because it's convenient for you." Lena and Lily looked up, confusion flickering in their young eyes. They didn't understand. Richard swallowed the lump in his throat. "I didn't know," he admitted. "I never knew about them." Jacob scoffed. "And what would you have done if you did? Sent a check. Olivia never wanted your money. She wanted you, Richard. But you chose your empire instead." Those words cut deeper than any business rival ever could. He had spent years believing that success would fill the emptiness inside him, that if he just made it to the top, he wouldn't need to look back. But now, looking at these two little girls, his daughters, he realized just how much he had lost. Richard took a slow breath. "I can't change the past," he said, "but I can be here now." Jacob's jaw tightened. "And then what? What happens when you get bored? When the next big deal takes over your life? These girls have already lost their mother. I won't let them get hurt again." Lena and Lily glanced between them, sensing the tension, but not fully understanding it. Richard knelt down, looking them in the eyes. "I know this isn't what you expected," he said softly. "And I know I don't deserve your trust yet, but I want to try. If you'll let me." Lena hesitated, clutching the letter to her chest. "Can you really send it to Mom?" Richard's throat tightened. He wished he could. He wished he had that kind of power. But no amount of wealth could bring Olivia back. "I can't," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I can read it with you. We can talk about her. Remember her together." Lily looked at Jacob. "Can we, Uncle Jacob?" Jacob let out a heavy sigh, his protective stance finally loosening. He looked at Richard, searching for something. Maybe sincerity, maybe regret, maybe proof that he wasn't the same man who had walked away all those years ago. After what felt like forever, Jacob nodded. "All right," he said quietly. "But if you hurt them, I won't," Richard promised. "Not again." They sat together on the steps of Sterling Tower, two little girls reading a letter to the mother they missed, and a father finally realizing what truly mattered. For the first time in his life, Richard Sterling wasn't thinking about business. He was thinking about family, and this time, He wasn't going to let it slip away.